The second part of this training will focus on the disabilities community. First, we are going to define some key concepts and discuss the ways they influence how society talks about and views disability. We also will cover how to practice cultural responsiveness on an individual level and the impacts it has on our work. Before I begin, I want to give a trigger warning. This presentation confronts and acknowledges white supremacy culture and the dominant ideologies it uses to oppress unrepresented and underrepresented communities. Our first concept is white supremacy culture. White supremacy culture refers to the dominant, unquestioned standards of behavior and ways of functioning embodied by the vast majority of institutions in the United States. These standards may be seen as mainstream, dominant cultural practices that have evolved from the United States history of white supremacy. Because it is so normalized, it can be hard to see, which only adds to its powerful hold. In many ways, it is indistinguishable from what we might call US culture or norms, a focus on individuals over groups, for example, or an emphasis on the written word as a form of professional communication. But it operates in even more subtle ways, by actually defining what normal is, and likewise what professional, effective, or even good is. In turn, white culture also defines what is not good, at risk, or unsustainable. White culture values some ways that are more familiar and come more naturally to those from a white, Western, traditional way of thinking, behaving, deciding, and knowing, while devaluing or rendering invisible other ways, and it does this without ever having to explicitly say so. Implicit bias, also known as unconscious or hidden bias, are negative associations, prejudices, and stereotypes that people unknowingly hold. They are expressed automatically without conscious awareness. Many studies have indicated that implicit biases affect individuals' attitudes and actions, thus creating real-world implications, even though individuals may not even be aware that those biases exist within themselves. Intersectionality is the interconnected nature of social categorizations such as race, class, and gender, regarded as creating overlapping and interdependent systems of discrimination or disadvantage. Exposing one's multiple identities can help clarify the ways in which a person can simultaneously experience privilege and oppression. For example, a Black woman in America does not experience gender inequalities in exactly the same way as a white woman, nor racial oppression identical to that experienced by a Black man. Each intersect produces a distinct quality of life. Now that we have defined white supremacy culture, implicit bias, and intersectionality, let's discuss the ways they impact culture, cultural competency, and cultural humility, the three elements that make up cultural responsiveness. White supremacy culture, by definition, is normalized and difficult to see, promoting resistance and defensiveness. It can be challenging to turn the mirror inward, particularly on sensitive topics like race and privilege. But when it is given a name and examples are pointed out, its presence is undeniable. It is important to remember that implicit biases operate almost entirely on an unconscious level and can be both positive and negative. All inequalities are connected. Biases may be overlapping or unique depending on identity. The human brain seeks to assimilate to the dominant culture while also categorizing, validating, and rationalizing its own experiences. Levels of implicit bias are very high, and the research is far more developed in measuring bias than effectively changing it. We know that people are less implicitly biased if they are exposed to counter-stereotypical individuals, but most white people lead very segregated lives. Counter-stereotypical is an idea or object that goes against a standardized mental picture that is held in common by members of a group and that represents an oversimplified opinion, prejudiced attitude, or uncritical judgment. We now are going to talk about ableism culture and its impact on the disabilities community. Ableism is a system that places value on people's bodies and minds based on societally constructed ideas of normalcy, intelligence, excellence, and productivity. These constructed ideas of normalcy, intelligence, excellence, and productivity are deeply rooted in anti-Blackness, eugenics, colonialism, and capitalism. This form of systemic oppression leads to people and society determining who is valuable or worthy based on people's appearance and/or their ability to satisfactorily produce, excel, and behave. Importantly, you do not have to have a disability to experience ableism. The ABCs of ableism. A, are ideas, emotions, affections, and reactions. B, behaviors, actions, practices, and policies that discriminate. C, cognitive beliefs, stereotypes, and ideologies that go beyond general negativity. White supremacy culture and ableism reinforce the medical model of disability. In the medical model, disability is viewed as a feature of the person. It is directly caused by disease, trauma, or health conditions, which requires medical care be provided in the form of individual treatment by professionals to ultimately fix the individuals with disabilities. Disability rights advocates say this view promotes a negative, disempowered image of people with disabilities. It makes the abnormal individual have the problem rather than assigning the problem to the political, social, and physical environment. It also creates low expectations and leads to people losing independence and choice and control in their own lives. This is just one example of the way dominant culture has developed the medical institution to systemically illegitimize people with identities not viewed as ideal by mainstream schools of thought. Ableism, like other isms such as racism and sexism, describes discrimination towards a social group, in this case, people with disabilities. But it also describes how certain ideals and attributes are valued or not valued. For example, walking is more socially valued than moving by way of wheelchair. There are different stereotypes and forms of ableism that impact a variety of communities, but I'm going to cover 4 major ones that affect the disabilities community. The first stereotype is that people with disabilities are viewed as the helpless victim. Their disability controls every aspect of their lives and dominates their thoughts. They cannot participate in activities or make decisions for themselves, and any difficulties they experience are due to personal characteristics rather than an inaccessible community. The second stereotype is that many people with disabilities are not seen as sexual beings or capable of being in a romantic relationship. And if people with disabilities are looking for a romantic partner, they only can or want to date other people with disabilities. This stereotype is a result of the eugenics movement, which started in 1880 and continues today. The Buck versus Bell Supreme Court decision ruled in 1927 that forced sterilization of people with disabilities was not a violation of their constitutional rights. The decision removed all restraints on eugenics. By the 1970s, over 60,000 people with disabilities were sterilized. The third stereotype is that people with disabilities are internally children. This can lead to the person not being able to make decisions for themselves, living segregated from the community, and creates a lack of believability with statements or reports made by people with disabilities. The fourth stereotype is that people with disabilities are brave, courageous, heroic, and inspirational for living with their disability. This stereotype led to the creation of inspiration porn. Inspiration porn is used to describe society's tendency to reduce people with disabilities down to objects of inspiration. This is most often displayed through images, videos, or feel-good articles that sensationalize people with disabilities. In inspiration porn, people with disabilities are generally praised for commonplace activities, like getting dressed or sitting at the beach. This makes it seem like people with disabilities are not capable of the same level of achievements as their able-bodied peers. Inspiration porn focuses on portraying visible disabilities as problems that need to be overcome. You have likely seen images or heard stories about heroic promposals where the able-bodied teens ask their peers with physical or intellectual disabilities to prom. Other stories have gone viral that include able-bodied students giving up their homecoming court titles for their peers with disabilities, or people in restaurants helping someone who uses a wheelchair access their food. Ableism not only maintains those 4 stereotypes we learned about on the last slide, it also preserves lower expectations for people with disabilities, a lack of choice and control around their own lives, bodies, and experiences, a loss of autonomy, exploited for work, segregated, hidden, and isolated from the community in institutions, asylums, hospitals, segregated classrooms, and sheltered workshops. We have learned about some key terms, attitudes, and beliefs that influence the way society views and talks about disability, whether it is consciously or not. Knowing this information can help individuals practice cultural responsiveness on an individual level, which in turn impacts the work they do. The first step is to assess, a willingness to accurately assess yourself and your limitations. This can be done by being made aware of implicit bias through self-reflection activities like feedback from the implicit bias test. Second is to embrace the complexity of diversity. Third, acknowledge gaps in your own cultural knowledge and understanding. Fourth, be open to new ideas, information, and advice that may conflict with your own. It is important to be mindful when you occupy a position of power. You should be thinking about how you can use your privilege to provide a platform for those who are not empowered to be heard and validated. There is a critical analysis as service providers and gatekeepers to the services. We must examine who we are in the process. Most people enter into this work because they recognize inequality and want to help, but we cannot be complacent. It is not enough to know why we must help. We must commit to continually improving how we help. Failure to properly address cultural differences creates and maintains mistrust and other potential conflicts between service providers and potential clients. Principles that guide our work. We need to be thinking about how intersectionality, white supremacy culture, and implicit bias play a role in the different communities we engage with. We need to be exposing discriminatory practices that continue to restrict, restrain, and incarcerate people on the basis of disability. We need to be sharing information about disability hate crimes that often go unreported. We need to challenge laws that prevent people with disabilities from voting, parenting, accessing healthcare, and identifying transportation options. We need to be asking who is not at the table and why not. As Andrea Smith expresses in her blog post, The Problem with Privilege, she says, "There is no simple anti-oppression formula that we can follow. We are in a constant state of trial and error and radical experimentation." Here's an activity to begin the first step of practicing cultural responsiveness, the implicit bias test. This test was developed by scientists from Harvard University, the University of Virginia, and the University of Washington, and measures the strengths and associations between concepts like Black people and evaluations, good or bad, or stereotypes such as athletic or clumsy. In closing, I want to show this equality to liberation graphic to demonstrate how, with a cultural responsiveness framework, we can move from equality to liberation. In the first image, it is assumed that everyone will benefit from the same supports. They are being treated equally. In the second image, individuals are given different supports to make it possible for them to have equal access to the game. They are being treated equitably. In the third image, all three can see the game without any supports or accommodations because the cause of the inequality was addressed. The systemic barrier has been removed. Within the context of white supremacy culture, implicit bias, intersectionality, and ableism, we must critically navigate our varied cultural identities and life experiences to create strong cultural responsiveness frameworks in all of our work, with the end goal being justice and liberation. Thank you for attending the Metro Regional Quality Council training on cultural responsiveness.